The cruelest invitations are the ones sent with a smile. The envelope arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, resting alone in Naomi Carter's mailbox like something that had been waiting for the perfect moment to hurt. She stood in the lobby of her apartment building, a paper coffee cup warming one hand while the gold lettering on the envelope caught the light. Ryan Mitchell. Even after 3 years, seeing his name still felt strange, not painful, just distant, like a song she used to know by heart but no longer remembered the words to. She carried the envelope upstairs without opening it. The elevator climbed slowly through 12 floors, its soft mechanical hum filling the silence. Inside her apartment, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor, painting long golden lines across the room. Naomi set her keys on the kitchen counter, placed the envelope beside them, and stared at it for several seconds. Then she opened it. The card inside was thick, expensive, and impossible to misunderstand. Ryan Mitchell and Olivia Brooks request the honor of your presence. Naomi read the sentence once. Then again. Not because she was surprised, but because she understood exactly what it meant. Ryan was getting married. And somehow, out of hundreds of people he could have invited, he had chosen her. Her thumb traced the edge of the invitation. Ryan never did anything by accident. Especially not something like this. Outside her window, traffic rolled through the city below, people rushing through their lives without knowing that a single piece of paper could carry so much history. Naomi lowered herself into a chair and looked toward the skyline. 3 years ago, she had cried when Ryan left. 3 years ago, she had spent nights wondering what she could have done differently. 3 years ago, she would have seen this invitation as proof she had lost. But that woman no longer existed. A faint vibration broke the silence. Her phone lit up on the table. A text message appeared. Unknown number. Naomi opened it. The message contained only one sentence. Hope you'll be there. Ryan. No congratulations. No kindness. No explanation. Used enough words to make his intention clear. Naomi looked at the screen for a long moment before placing the phone face down. Across the room, her reflection appeared faintly in the glass of the window. Calm. Composed. Unmoved. Somewhere in another part of the city, Ryan was probably imagining her reaction. It was probably imagining regret. Maybe even heartbreak. What he didn't know was that Naomi had spent the last 3 years becoming someone he no longer understood. She folded the invitation carefully and placed it back into the envelope. Then she smiled. Not because she planned to confront him. Not because she wanted revenge. But because for the first time, she realized Ryan had no idea who would be walking into that wedding beside her. So many people mistake silence for weakness because they have never seen what strength looks like when it no longer needs approval. Naomi left the invitation on her kitchen counter for 3 days. Not hidden. Not forgotten. Used wedding. Every morning she passed it on her way to work. Every evening she saw it sitting beneath the soft light above the counter. The envelope never moved, but somehow it seemed to grow heavier with every passing day. On Friday evening, rain tapped gently against the windows of her apartment while the city lights blurred into ribbons of gold and white beyond the glass. Naomi stood in front of her closet, studying a row of dresses she had not worn in years. Not because she planned to impress anyone. Not because she wanted Ryan to regret anything. She simply refused to arrive looking like a woman carrying old wounds. 3 years earlier, she had done enough of that. Her phone buzzed on the dresser. A message from her closest friend appeared on the screen. You are not actually thinking about going, are you? Naomi smiled faintly. It was the same reaction everyone had given her. Nobody understood why she would willingly attend the wedding. Nobody understood that avoiding the event would only give it power. She typed a short response. Yes. Then she set the phone aside. Across town, preparations for the wedding continued. Photographers posted previews online. Olivia shared pictures of flower arrangements and custom decorations. Friends filled social media. with comments about fairy tale endings and perfect couples. Naomi saw some of it. Not because she searched for it, but because people kept sending it to her. She never replied. She never defended herself. She never explained her side of the story. The strange thing about peace was that it often looked exactly like surrender to people who needed drama to understand strength. Late at night, Naomi opened a drawer beside her bed and removed a small velvet box. Inside it rested a simple wedding band. She turned it slowly between her fingers as moonlight spilled across the room. Unlike Ryan's invitation, this ring carried no performance. No audience. No announcement. Only certainty. Her eyes softened. Not with sadness. With gratitude. She placed the ring back into the box and closed the lid. The following afternoon, another message arrived. This time from a contact saved under a single name. Alexander. The text was brief. What time should I pick you up? Naomi stared at the screen for a moment before typing her reply. None works. A few seconds later came the response. Perfect. There were no emojis. No grand premises. No dramatic speeches. Used two simple words. Yet somehow they settled her nerves more than any reassurance could have. Naomi set the phone down and walked toward the window. Far below, traffic moved through the streets in steady streams. Somewhere beyond those buildings, Ryan was probably imagining her arriving alone. It was probably imagining the look on her face when she watched him exchange vows. It was probably imagining a version of Naomi that no longer existed. What Ryan did not know was that while he had spent 3 years building a new image, Naomi had spent 3 years building a new life. And in less than 24 hours, those two realities were finally going to meet in the same room. The truth about public humiliation is that it rarely begins with a microphone. Most of the time, it starts with a seat assignment. Sunday arrived wrapped in clear blue skies and warm spring sunlight. The wedding venue sat on a private estate just outside the city, surrounded by rolling green lawns, white floral arrangements, and polished stone pathways that stretched across several acres. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Ballets moved quickly between arriving guests. Laughter floated through the air alongside the distant sound of a string quartet performing near the ceremony garden. Naomi stood beside the passenger door of a black sedan, taking in the scene for a brief moment. She wore a simple navy dress that favored elegance over attention. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to compete. She had not come to be noticed. A staff member greeted her with a practiced smile and checked her name against a digital guest list. The smile flickered almost imperceptibly. Then the woman pointed toward the far side of the ceremony seating. Naomi followed her gaze. The very last row. The furthest section from the altar. The kind of placement reserved for distant acquaintances and forgotten obligations. Naomi simply nodded. She did not complain. She did not ask questions. The staff member looked almost disappointed by the lack of reaction. As Naomi walked toward the seating area, conversation softened around her. A few guests recognized her immediately. Some looked away. Others whispered behind carefully raised glasses. She could almost feel the assumptions moving through the crowd. Poor Naomi. That must be difficult. I cannot believe she actually came. Yet nobody approached her directly. Sympathy was often most comfortable from a distance. Near the front of the garden, Ryan stood speaking with several guests. His tailored tuxedo fit perfectly. Confidence radiated from every gesture. Olivia stood beside him in an elegant white gown, smiling for photographs as flashes reflected across crystal decorations and polished silver accents. At one point Ryan glanced toward the crowd. His eyes found Naomi instantly. For a fraction of a second, satisfaction crossed his face. Not happiness. Not surprise. Satisfaction. As though a prediction had just been confirmed. Naomi noticed it. Then calmly looked away. She settled into her assigned seat and folded her hands in her lap. Around here, guests continued arriving. Rows filled with family members, executives, friends, and social acquaintances. Nobody noticed the empty seat beside her. At least not yet. 20 minutes before the ceremony, another black vehicle rolled quietly into the estate entrance. It was not larger than the others. It did not arrive with flashing cameras or visible security. In fact, most people barely paid attention. A tall man stepped out wearing a charcoal gray suit and a simple silver watch. No dramatic entrance. No attempt to command attention. He thanked the driver, adjusted his cuff, and began walking toward the garden. Several guests glanced his way before returning to their conversations. Naomi looked up as he approached. The smallest smile touched her face. The man reached her row and stopped beside the empty chair. "Good morning," Alexander said warmly. Naomi stood and returned the smile. "Good morning." Then, without another word, he took the seat beside her. Neither of them noticed the woman 2 rows ahead quietly staring at Alexander with growing confusion, as if she was certain she had seen him somewhere before. Sometimes the people who change your life arrive so quietly that you do not realize their importance until much later. As guests settled into their seats and the music drifted across the garden, Naomi found herself looking at Alexander for a brief moment. He appeared exactly as he always did. Calm. Unhurried. Comfortable in his own presence. The irony was almost amusing. 3 years earlier, if someone had told her that this man would one day be sitting beside her at a wedding where her past and present were about to collide, she never would have believed them. Back then, her life looked very different. The divorce had not happened overnight. It arrived in pieces. Missed conversations. Empty promises. Growing distance. Rajan became increasingly focused on appearances, business events, and the image he wanted the world to see. Naomi remembered sitting alone at dinner tables waiting for meetings that always ran late. She remembered convincing herself that success required sacrifice. She remembered defending him to friends who quietly worried about her. Then came the day she could no longer ignore what was standing directly in front of her. The marriage was ending long before the paperwork arrived. The signatures only confirmed what silence had already decided. The months afterward were some of the loneliest of her life. She moved into a smaller apartment. Sold things she no longer needed. Learned how to rebuild routines around a future she had never planned for. Friends expected anger. Others expected revenge. Naomi gave them neither. Instead, she focused on surviving one ordinary day at a time. She worked. She exercised. She read books she had been too busy to finish. She discovered that healing was not dramatic. Most of the time it looked like making coffee at 6 in the morning and continuing to move forward. Nearly a year after the divorce, she attended a non-profit fundraising event for a youth education program. She almost did not go. Rain covered the city that evening and exhaustion nearly convinced her to stay home. But she went anyway. The ballroom was crowded with donors, business leaders, and community organizers. Naomi stood near a refreshment table reviewing information about the program when someone accidentally bumped into her. A folder slipped from her hands. Papers scattered across the polished floor. Before she could react, another person knelt beside her and began gathering the documents. "I think these belong to you," he said. That was the first thing Alexander Hayes ever said to her. No grand introduction. No dramatic moment. No attempt to impress her. Used kindness. Over the following months they crossed paths repeatedly through charitable events and community projects. Conversations became lunches. Lunches became friendship. Friendship became trust. What surprised Naomi most was not what Alexander said. It was what he never said. He never asked her to prove her worth. He never treated her like a project that needed fixing. He never made her feel smaller so he could feel larger. Sitting beside him now, listening to distant wedding music float across the garden, Naomi realized something she had not fully appreciated before. Raijan had spent years teaching her what love should not feel like. Alexander had quietly shown her what it should. The people who matter most are often the ones nobody notices at first. The ceremony began beneath a canopy of white roses and soft afternoon sunlight. Guests turned their attention toward the front rows as music filled the garden. Raijan stood at the altar with practiced confidence, exchanging smiles with family members and longtime friends. Olivia looked radiant as cameras captured every carefully planned detail. From a distance, everything appeared perfect. Naomi sat quietly beside Alexander, her attention focused on the ceremony rather than the crowd. Yet something subtle had started to change around them. The woman who had been staring at Alexander earlier continued glancing back every few minutes. Finally, she leaned toward the man sitting beside her and whispered something. His eyes widened slightly. Then he looked back too. A few rows away, another guest seemed to notice the exchange. Soon, small pockets of curiosity began moving through the audience like ripples spreading across still water. Alexander remained completely unaware or perhaps simply unconcerned. He listened attentively during the ceremony, occasionally exchanging a quiet comment with Naomi. Nothing about his behavior suggested importance. If anything, his calmness made him easier to overlook. The ceremony ended with applause. Guests stood and began making their way toward the reception hall located across the estate grounds. Crystal chandeliers glowed behind floor-to-ceiling windows while servers prepared tables covered in elegant floral centerpieces. As Naomi and Alexander entered the reception area, they were directed toward a table near the back of the room. Not the worst table. Not the best. A polite compromise. Naomi almost smiled at the symbolism. Raijan had not seated her completely out of sight. He wanted her visible enough to witness his success. Used not important enough to share it. Across the room, Ryan moved comfortably through conversations, accepting congratulations and posing for photographs. Olivia remained close beside him, greeting guests with effortless charm. Several times Ryan's eyes drifted toward Naomi's table. Each glance seemed to reassure him that everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Then something unexpected happened. An older gentleman near the center of the ballroom froze mid conversation. His attention shifted toward Alexander. For a brief second he looked uncertain, as though questioning his own memory. Then he excused himself from the group and walked directly across the room. Naomi noticed him approaching. Alexander stood politely as the man arrived. "Good to see you again, Alexander," the gentleman said warmly while extending his hand. "It has been far too long." Alexander returned the handshake with an easy smile. "It has. How have you been?" The exchange lasted less than a minute. Simply respectful. Yet when the gentleman returned to his table, several people immediately began asking questions. Who was that? How did he know him? Why did he walk across the entire room just to say hello? Naomi saw curiosity beginning to spread. Alexander, however, seemed entirely unaffected. He resumed his seat and thanked the server who placed a glass of sparkling water beside him. Across the ballroom, Ryan noticed the interaction. For the first time all afternoon, a faint crease appeared between his brows. It vanished almost immediately. But not before Naomi saw it. And somewhere deep inside the room, a quiet shift had already begun. Power rarely announces itself. Most of the time, it reveals itself through the reactions of other people. The reception continued beneath sparkling chandeliers and warm golden lighting that reflected across crystal glasses and polished marble floors. Conversations flowed easily. Laughter echoed between tables. A live jazz band played softly near the dance floor while servers moved through the ballroom carrying trays of appetizers and champagne. On the surface, everything looked exactly as a wedding reception should. Yet around Naomi and Alexander, something unusual was beginning to take shape. It started with small moments. A woman seated near the front table paused in the middle of a conversation after looking toward Alexander. A few minutes later, a man in an expensive tailored suit quietly approached their table. Naomi noticed how his posture changed the moment he reached Alexander. It was not friendliness. It was respect. Genuine respect. Alexander stood and shook his hand. The two exchanged a brief conversation. Before the man wished them a pleasant evening and returned to his table. 10 minutes later, it happened again. Then again. Each interaction lasted less than a minute, but each one left behind more questions than answers. Guests began watching from a distance. Curiosity spread faster than conversation. Naomi could feel it moving through the room. Meanwhile, Alexander remained exactly the same. Calm. Polite. Unimpressed by the attention. He spent more time asking Naomi if she wanted another glass of sparkling water than discussing whatever business matters those visitors seemed eager to mention. Across the ballroom, Ryan was beginning to notice. He stood near the head table speaking with a group of guests when his attention drifted once more toward Naomi's side of the room. This time he watched as another distinguished guest crossed the ballroom specifically to greet Alexander. Ryan frowned slightly. Olivia followed his gaze. "Who is that guy?" she asked quietly. Ryan looked for a moment before shrugging. "Probably someone from her work." Yet even as he said it, he did not sound convinced. The evening moved forward. Dinner was served. Toasts were given. Guests applauded stories about love, commitment, and new beginnings. Then something happened that changed the atmosphere entirely. The bride's father had spent most of the evening entertaining several prominent business associates near a reserved VIP section of the ballroom. He was a successful developer with connections throughout the state. People came to him. He rarely went to them. Yet midway through dinner, he suddenly stood from his table. Without explanation, he crossed the entire ballroom. Conversations slowed as guests watched him approach Naomi and Alexander. When he reached their table, his expression brightened immediately. "Alexander," he said warmly, extending both hands. "I had no idea you would be here tonight." "It has been years." Naomi noticed the reaction before Alexander even answered. Several executives at nearby tables stopped talking. A few guests turned completely in their chairs. The bride's father was not greeting Alexander like an acquaintance. He was greeting him like someone whose presence mattered. Ryan noticed it too. This time the crease between his brows did not disappear. Across the room, Olivia looked visibly confused. And for the first time since the reception began, Ryan stopped smiling completely. He still did not know who Alexander was. But he was beginning to understand that everyone else seemed to know something he did not. Arrogance has a strange habit of revealing itself precisely when caution would have been wiser. The reception had entered its most relaxed phase of the evening. Dinner plates were being cleared away. Guests moved between tables, conversations blended together beneath the music, and the energy of the room shifted from formal celebration to casual networking. Yet Ryan's attention remained fixed on one question he could not answer. Who was Alexander Hayes? He had asked 2 friends already. Neither knew. He had searched his memory several times and found nothing. Still, the growing number of influential guests approaching Alexander was becoming impossible to ignore. Ryan finally decided to handle the situation himself. With a confident smile fixed in place, he crossed the ballroom with Olivia beside him. Several nearby guests immediately noticed where they were headed. Conversation softened. Curiosity sharpened. Naomi saw Ryan approaching long before he arrived at their table. Alexander noticed too, though his expression remained unchanged. Ryan stopped beside them and smiled. "Naomi, I am glad you made it." His voice carried the polished friendliness people use when they want an audience to hear them. Naomi returned a polite nod. "Congratulations, Ryan." Olivia offered a smile that felt rehearsed. "It is nice to see you doing well." Naomi thanked her quietly. For a moment, the conversation seemed harmless. Then Ryan's attention shifted toward Alexander. "And you are?" Alexander stood and extended his hand. "Alexander Ayes." Ryan shook it. "Firm. Professional." Yet something about Alexander's calm confidence seemed to bother him. "How do you know Naomi?" Ryan asked. Naomi felt the question for what it truly was. Not curiosity. Evaluation. Alexander glanced briefly toward her before answering. "We have been married for 2 years." The words landed gently. Yet the effect was immediate. Ryan blinked. Olivia's smile froze for a fraction of a second. Around them, several guests pretended not to listen while listening very carefully. "Married?" Ryan repeated. "That is surprising." Naomi recognized that tone. She had heard it before. The tone people use when reality refuses to match their assumptions. Ryan laughed softly and looked around. "Well, good for you. I guess things worked out after all." Then came the mistake. The one born from pride rather than wisdom. Ryan glanced at Alexander's simple suit and understated watch. No visible display of wealth. No entourage. No signs of status. In Ryan's mind, he already knew the answer. "So what line of work are you in?" he asked casually. Alexander smiled. "Business." Ryan chuckled. "Business covers a lot of ground. I suppose not all of us can spend our lives building companies." A few nearby guests shifted uncomfortably. Naomi remained silent. Alexander remained silent. Ryan interpreted their silence as confirmation. It continued speaking. "Marriage after divorce can be complicated. Naomi always appreciated stability. I am glad she found someone who could provide that." Olivia laughed softly beside him. The sound echoed more loudly than she intended. Then something unexpected happened. A voice from across the room interrupted the moment. "Ryan." The bride's father was approaching quickly. His expression carried none of the amusement Ryan expected. In fact, it carried something very different. Concern. He stopped beside the table and looked directly at Ryan. "You do know who this is, right?" The smile disappeared from Ryan's face. And for the first time that evening, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The most powerful moments are often the quietest ones. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The bride's father stood beside the table looking directly at Ryan, waiting for an answer that never came. Ryan forced a laugh. "So the older man's expression shifted from concern to disbelief. Around them, nearby conversations faded completely. Guests who had only been pretending not to listen no longer bothered pretending. The room had become too interested. The bride's father turned toward Alexander. "I thought you would be in Singapore this week," he said. Alexander smiled politely. "My schedule changed. Naomi and I already had plans." The response was simple, but it carried an effortless familiarity that immediately raised even more questions. Ryan looked from one man to the other. Olivia did the same. Finally, the bride's father spoke the name with the same recognition someone might reserve for a major public figure. Alexander Ayes. Founder and chairman of Hayes Global Holdings. The words seemed to hang in the air. Several guests exchanged startled looks. Others immediately recognized the name. One woman covered her mouth in surprise. A man near the dance floor whispered something to his wife, and her eyes widened instantly. Ryan remained perfectly still. Ayes Global Holdings was not a company people casually overlooked. Its investments stretched across technology, infrastructure, healthcare, and real estate. News outlets covered its acquisitions. Financial networks analyzed its decisions. The company employed tens of thousands of people across multiple countries. Ryan knew the name. Everyone in his industry knew the name. What he could not understand was how Naomi's husband had been sitting quietly in the back of the room all afternoon without anyone announcing it. Olivia looked at Alexander again as though seeing him for the first time. Then another guest approached their table. This time it was the chief executive officer of a regional investment group. He greeted Alexander warmly. Before that conversation could finish, another executive arrived. Then another. Within minutes, a steady stream of influential guests began making their way across the ballroom. Nobody had organized it. Nobody had planned it. Recognition simply spread through the room. Naomi watched the reactions without saying a word. She had seen this before. Alexander never introduced himself using titles. He never led conversations with accomplishments. People either knew who he was or they did not. Across the ballroom, Ryan's confidence seemed to drain away one realization at a time. Every interaction made the truth harder to ignore. The man he had dismissed moments earlier was not an ordinary guest. It was easily the most influential person in the room. More surprising still, he appeared completely uninterested in proving it. Alexander thanked each person who approached. He asked about families. He remembered names. He listened more than he spoke. The contrast was impossible not to notice. Ryan had spent the entire evening performing success. Alexander carried it so naturally that he never needed to mention it at all. Finally, the bride's father leaned closer to Ryan and spoke quietly enough that only a few nearby guests could hear. You invited Naomi because you thought she would feel small. Ryan said nothing. The older man glanced toward Alexander and Naomi. Looks like you misunderstood the situation. Across the ballroom, Naomi met Ryan's eyes for the first time since the reception began. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply looked calm. And somehow that made the moment feel even heavier. Winning is overrated when compared to peace. The reception continued, but something fundamental had changed. Conversations resumed. Music returned. Glasses clinked. Yet the illusion Ryan had carefully built throughout the day could not be restored. The room now saw Naomi differently. More importantly, Ryan saw her differently. For years, he had carried a private story about their divorce. In that story, he had moved forward while Naomi remained behind. He had convinced himself that success belonged to him and regret belonged to her. Standing there now, watching influential guests gather around Alexander and greet Naomi with growing respect, he was forced to confront a reality he had never imagined. She had not been left behind. She had simply kept moving without him. Naomi felt none of the triumph Ryan expected she would feel. There was no satisfaction in proving him wrong. No desire to embarrass him. Those emotions belonged to an earlier version of herself, a woman who had spent too much energy seeking validation from people who no longer deserved it. That woman was gone. Alexander glanced toward her. Ready? He asked softly. Naomi smiled. Yes. They stood together. No dramatic announcement followed. No final speech. No public confrontation. They simply prepared to leave. As they crossed the ballroom, people greeted them warmly. Some introduced themselves. Others thanked Alexander for his work. A few congratulated Naomi. She accepted each interaction with quiet grace. Near the exit, she passed Ryan one final time. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the reception seemed to fade into the background. Ryan looked at her as though trying to understand how the years between them had rewritten everything he thought he knew. Naomi met his eyes calmly. There was no anger there. No bitterness. Only peace. And somehow that seemed harder for him to face than resentment ever could have been. Then she offered a small smile. Not a victorious smile. Not a mocking smile. Simply the smile of someone who no longer carried the weight of old disappointments. Beside her, Alexander opened the door leading toward the estate courtyard. Cool evening air drifted inside. Together they stepped out beneath a sky filled with stars. The sounds of the reception softened behind them as they walked along the stone pathway toward the waiting car. Naomi glanced back only once. Through the ballroom windows, the celebration continued. People laughed. Music played. Life moved forward. Just as it always had. She turned away and continued walking. Her hand slipped naturally into Alexander's. 3 years earlier, she had thought losing her marriage was the end of her story. Tonight she finally understood the truth. It had simply been the end of the wrong chapter. She had not come back to prove her worth. She had come back already knowing it. And that was why she walked away with something far more valuable than revenge. She walked away free.